All right, so you got a stack of IMDb reviews for Money Heist, and you're wondering, is it worth all the hype? Should I actually watch this thing?
Ooh.
We're going to dive deep into what viewers are saying about the show to help you figure that out, both the good and the bad. And joining us today, we've got an expert in media trends to help us break it all down.
Well, we've got reviews ranging from masterpiece to total disaster. Clearly, Money Heist is a show that evokes some pretty strong feelings, so what we want to do today is figure out if those feelings might resonate with you.
Okay, so let's start with the extremes, shall we? One reviewer writes, "Do yourself a favor. Don't watch season 3, 4, and 5. Ouch, that's harsh. They go on to say that it's a huge drop in quality after the first 2 seasons. But then we have another review that says, one of the best I've seen. So what gives?
Well, for those unfamiliar, Money Heist is a Spanish show that kind of blew up internationally. The early seasons, the first tier in particular, received a ton of praise, for having a really fresh take on the heist genre. But as we go into the later seasons, well, that's where things get a little bumpy.
Yeah, and we definitely see that reflected in these reviews. A lot of people were loving those first couple of seasons and then, bam, felt let down. The question is why? Why is that happening?
All right, so to try and make sense of it, I think we need to look at 3 key aspects of the show. That's the plot, the characters, and the overall pacing. We're going to start with the plot because we see comments like, should have ended at season 2, and how to ruin a fantastic series 101. Those are some harsh words, but I think they do kind of tap into this common feeling. The later seasons got too predictable.
Okay, but predictable, that's pretty subjective, right? Like some reviewers clearly love the amped-up action. They're describing it as fast-paced and gripping. I mean, isn't it just down to a matter of personal taste?
Oh, absolutely. Taste plays a huge role. But I think what made Money Heist initially stand out was its cleverness, the twists and turns you just didn't see coming. And I think many felt like they lost that. For example, one specific critique was how the Wold Heist in later seasons felt like a rehash of the Royal Mint plot, just with a different location. And, that lack of originality is what some viewers found disappointing.
Ah, okay. So even if the action is good, maybe it's not the same kind of good, right? The kind that hooked people in the beginning. So what about the characters? So you saw some strong reactions there.
Definitely. One review that sticks out is complaining about unnecessary floods of new characters. And, when a show starts adding a bunch of new faces, especially in later seasons, it can definitely feel like they're just trying to stretch things out artificially.
Yeah, it's like, hey, we're already invested in this core group. Why do we need this whole new crew thrown in? But, I mean, just being a new character isn't a problem in itself, right? Did any of the reviews pinpoint what made the new characters specifically problematic?
Right. It really comes down to how they fit into the overall story. One review I came across specifically called out the character of Manila, who's introduced in season 3, and they felt her introduction was really forced and that it kind of undermined the emotional stakes that had been built up around the original team. And now, of course, not everyone felt that way, but it is a notable critique.
Interesting. So we've got potential plot predictability and maybe some character issues. What about the pacing of the show? Did the show become a slog or what?
Well, this is where things get really interesting because you have some viewers, like the one who said they Bing-watched for 17 hours, clearly found that the show maintained its momentum, right? But then others felt like it kind of went off the rails, that the action overtook the intricate planning that defined those early seasons. I think the quote about the gunfights being worse than stormtroopers kind of sums up that sentiment.
Wow. So it seems like Money Heist might have fallen into that classic trap, sacrificing what made it special for more generic thrills. I'm starting to see why the reactions are so divided.
Exactly. And to figure out where you might land in all of this, you really have to ask yourself, what do you value in a show? Do you need intricate plotting? Or are you happy with a high-action spectacle, even if it gets a bit familiar?
Yeah, great question. This whole thing about sacrificing cleverness for action, I see that in so many shows. It's like the writers think, well, explosions are exciting. Let's just add more.
Right.
But it doesn't always work.
Yeah, that's the classic jump the shark dilemma, right? When a show finds success, there's all this pressure to just keep escalating the stakes, even if it means losing sight of, what made it great in the first place.
And with Money Heist, I mean, that initial brilliance, it really was about the characters, right? Even with the crazy masks and the code names, they felt real, each with their own motivations and everything. Did any of the reviews talk about how those characters changed in the later seasons?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, one review I found particularly insightful actually called out the professor, the mastermind behind it all, and they felt like in the later seasons, his character became almost too perfect. Like, always able to outsmart the police, no matter how ridiculous the plan.
Yeah, I see that. So he kind of lost that vulnerability, like the sense that he could actually fail.
Exactly.
It becomes less believable, right? Maybe even a little boring if he's always like 5 steps ahead.
Precisely, yeah. It's like watching a chess grandmaster playing against a bunch of beginners. I mean, it might be impressive at first, but eventually you want a challenge, you know? You want some tension.
And maybe that ties back into the predictability issue we were talking about before. If the professor always has a solution, then where's the suspense? You just know he's going to pull something out of his hat.
Exactly. And that sense of tension, that's what keeps viewers on the edge of their seats, right? Without it, even the most elaborate heist can feel kind of flat.
So we've got this potential downward spiral. The plot gets predictable, the characters lose their edge, the pacing maybe gets too frantic with all the action. No wonder some viewers felt let down.
Yeah, but it's important to remember, though, these are just trends we're observing from the reviews, right? Not everyone felt this way. There are plenty of viewers who clearly enjoyed the ride, even if it became a bit of a roller coaster in those later seasons.
Right, right. There's always that group that loves everything.
Yeah.
But for someone who's trying to decide if Money Heist is worth their time, I mean, this analysis is super helpful. It's not just about whether the show is good or bad. It's about understanding what kind of good or bad it might be.
Absolutely. And that's what I think is so fascinating about, analyzing audience reactions. It's not about, declaring a definitive verdict. It's about uncovering those nuances, those points of divergence that can really help someone decide if a show aligns with their taste.
Okay, so let's try to put it all together. We've explored the strength of Money Heist, that original spark of brilliance. But we've also, looked at the potential pitfalls, those elements that might have led to the decline some viewers perceived. So what's the takeaway for our listener today? What should they be thinking about?
I think the key question to ask yourself is, what kind of viewer are you? If you love shows that keep you guessing, that have those intricate plots and characters with real depth, then those first 2 seasons of Money Heist are almost guaranteed to be a hit.
Hmm.
But if you're more about that action spectacle, the thrill of the moment, even if the plot gets a little far-fetched and the characters become a little bit more, archetypal, then you might still enjoy the later seasons. It's a different kind of enjoyment, but it's still valid.
That's a really good way to put it. It's not about saying one part of the show is objectively better. It's about understanding those different appeals and figuring out which one resonates with you. And speaking of resonance, there's one more layer to this Money Heist phenomenon that I think is super interesting. We've talked about plot and characters and pacing, but you know what? There's this whole other level to Money Heist that I think gets overlooked, and it might actually be the key to the whole thing.
What do you mean?
Well, a lot of these reviewers, even the ones who are criticizing the later seasons, they still admit to being completely hooked. Like, they were frustrated, maybe even disappointed, but they couldn't stop watching. Why is that?
That's a really good point. Yeah, it's almost like the show tapped into something primal, something beyond just entertainment.
Exactly. And I think it all comes down to this theme of rebellion that runs throughout the entire series. I mean, these characters, even with all their flaws, they're fighting against the system that they see as corrupt. They're taking matters into their own hands, and that's a powerful fantasy, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it speaks to that, deep-seated desire for agency for justice, even if it's achieved through unconventional or even criminal means.
And it's not even just about the heists themselves, right? Think about the whole iconography of the show. The dolly masks, the red jumpsuits, the Bella Ciao anthem. It all becomes a symbol of resistance, of defiance.
It's almost like the show created its own counterculture, a world where the lines between right and wrong become kind of blurred. And I think that's what makes it so compelling, even when the plots get a little, out there.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, what does it say about us as viewers that we're so drawn to these stories of rebellion, even when we know, logically, that robbing a bank is probably not the best way to solve your problems?
Right. That is the fascinating thing about fiction. It allows us to explore these complex ideas, these moral gray areas. But in a safe space, we can root for the underdog, even if their actions are, questionable, because ultimately we know it's not real.
So it's not just about enjoying the heist. It's about engaging with these bigger questions about power, about justice, about the systems you live in.
Exactly, and that's something to think about. Even if you decide that Money Heist isn't for you, how do these themes resonate in other stories we consume? What does it say about our own desires, our own frustrations?
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. So to wrap up our deep dive into Money Heist, if you're looking for a show that's going to challenge you, entertain you, and maybe even make you question a few things, Money Heist is definitely worth checking out.
Just remember, go in with an open mind. Be prepared for some twists and turns, and most importantly, enjoy the ride.
And who knows, maybe you'll even find yourself coming belly chow long after the credits roll. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.